you should get now. There you go. You'll get your little notification.
Recording has started. I'm giving my consent for this meeting to be recorded, apparently.
It's all sort of a bit backwards. We discussed it with Tass before, that I think you probably have to tell them before the meeting that it's going to be recorded, and then otherwise it's a bit unfair, really. But
yeah.
I'm sure people aren't recording all of their team meetings all over the place. But so if it's your first time watching this, then welcome to the Data Protection Diaries Pub Chats. If it's not your first time, welcome back, and we appreciate you coming back. We are joined today by a very good friend of ours, Ralph O'Brien, who has been in and around privacy and security for 20 years?
22.
22 years now.
You get less for murder, as they say, right? Less for murder.
You genuinely do, actually. You'd be out in 15, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things about you is that you do cross that divergence between privacy and security. Like your roles over the years have been different. You've gone from the public sector, you've gone right the way through to consulting. You understand frameworks, you understand security controls. So it's a different place that you come from, I think, for many. Do you want to give us a little background to like where all this started?
Yeah, well, obviously, when I was 3 years old, I decided I want to be a data protection guru. No. Yeah, I mean, I kind of started my career by running away from things, I guess. I wanted to be, how do I put it, when I first started? I wanted to be in the police, believe it or not. And because I was fairly academic, my parents, lovely as they are, said, no, you're not going to be a police officer because you're fairly academic. You're going to be a lawyer. No, you're not going to be a lawyer. You're going to be a judge. No, you're not going to be a judge. You're going to be a high court judge. And it wasn't until I was at university doing law that I kind of went, what the hell am I doing here? I wanted to be a policeman. So I literally ran away and joined the army. And I happened to turn up on the night that the Rural Signals were recruiting. And so I ended up doing communication security, and then they tried to send me somewhere hot and sandy, and I didn't like that very much. So I ran away from that as well. And it was purely that I ended up working in local government in '98 when the Data Protection Act came in, and somebody saw law and computing on my CV and said, Ralph, go away and learn about this. And I went, all right. And I became a local government data protection officer, and I just fell in love. I went away on this course for a week, and especially starting in the public sector, needs of the many compared to the needs of the few. Ironically, I ended up working for the police in short order afterwards, but on the data protection side rather than as a police officer, and that was really what changed my career, because it was the Soham inquiry, it was the Bitchard inquiry, it was the Ian Huntley murders.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and up until that point, it sounds bizarre to think about it, but 20 years ago, police forces didn't talk to each other. Their systems were set up in every county, and they were bought separately. And so, it was a question of someone moving over a border and disappearing, and the police not being able to track them. So really, my start was about information sharing agreements, trying to doing metadata about police systems actually talking to each other, helping set up what was at the time the Criminal Records Bureau, now the Disclosure and Barring Service.
Yeah.
We had some really interesting fundamental questions back then, like because Huntley himself, he was convicted of a burglary when he was younger. He had all these allegations against him, and it was a question of, well, because he's never been convicted in a court of law, should that have stopped him from getting a job, or does the smoke equal fire? And really interesting sort of fundamental society questions, because they could equally have been a campaign and malicious allegation. But the information was up in Humberside, and he was down in Cambridgeshire, and the Bitchard inquiry really sort of blew the lid off all this stuff. And very kindly, I was asked to write for ACPO, the Association of Chief Police Officers, along with a greater team, a data protection audit manual. And so, writing sort of information sharing and data protection audit manual, which is more data quality audits back then than anything else, checking reason codes for why people had looked at the police national computer, that sort of stuff, to make sure they weren't checking out their daughter's boyfriends and random stuff like that. It's a really interesting time, just a really interesting time. And at the time, the struggle was connection. Now kind of our struggle is separation. But yeah, it kind of started me on the standards route, helping write, contributing to the early ICO audit manual, helping a little standard known as ISO 17799. It was a British standard, 17799, which later became ISO 27001. So helping BSI create that on the security side, it was a really sort of interesting time. But yeah, standards and regulatory compliance way before I was even a consultant, way before I was even a trainer. So yeah, I guess I'm a real public sector techie geek standards guy at heart. Yeah, data protection nerd, but because I started in the public sector, there's these fundamental questions of needs of the many compared to the needs of the few.
Yeah.
Fundamental human rights versus the needs of the state and corporations and organizations, which I guess is the heart of data protection, where you strike that balance, Anyway, cheers. Sorry, cheers.
Cheers, yeah.
It is, I don't condone lunchtime drinking, but privacy officer arms and all that.
It's a Friday, the sun is shining. Like, it's all right, it's permitted. You don't have to do a particular amount of work this afternoon. So, like, it's crazy because there's not many people that have that sort of insight that you have in terms of where all this, like, kind of, but where it came from. A lot of people that we talk to, certainly on this channel, you've got the practitioners, so the people that, the implementers, taking a risk-based approach, and trying to find their way around the commercial aspects of the organisation and the regulation. You've got the lawyers who take more often more of a hard stance approach. What is purely defensible? What does the regulation state? What can I argue in court? And then in the middle, you've got standards, frameworks, the implementation of both of those parts. And from your experience, we're not talking about somebody that's read and understood a standard. We're talking about somebody that created and wrote the standard to try and sew these things together.
I mean, it's like pulling teeth. I'm very privileged to sit on the international standards body that writes 27001. Along with Alan Shipman, who I'm sure you'll know that is much more active in the area than I am, even much more active. But it was a privilege to sit on that. It's been a privilege to sit on the committee that's now writing 27701, the privacy management system add-on. So some of the standards have been devalued by the way they've been audited, by the way they've been assessed, by the way some companies have tried to implement them over the years. But I do think they've got value, certainly providing assurance in the supply chain, that sort of thing. In the absence of, funny enough, I've just come off an ICO webinar on their GDPR certification schemes.
Yeah.
Literally the call before this. So I think these things have got a place. There's value. There's certainly a lot of people asking for them. I've always been a little bit cautious about words like compliance. Personally, I don't like people who talk about GDPR compliance or the fact they're GDPR compliant. I much prefer about having a management system maturity approach. I kind of think about organizations as, you can never be compliant. You can never have all of your records within their retention period. You can never claim to have, when you've got words like appropriate and necessary and adequate, it's not a binary yes, no compliance activity. It's always going to be risk management. There's always going to be systems that are legacy that don't comply. There are always going to be things, and I really hate it. It also encourages that management attitude of, oh, we're done now. You've got the green, you've got the tick in the box. We can stop now. We can go back to normal. That external threat, I've fixed it. Whereas I've kind of been campaigning for a long time that there's a huge difference between fundamental rights to privacy, data protection law, and data ethics. And I think organizations kind of go through a maturity cycle, of understanding, of seeing things as this external threat that's got to find them. Let's face it, pretty unlikely at the moment with the current state of, the play within in the UK, to something that's a real asset for information management, to do we comply with the law, to bloody hell, this is a good thing. This can increase my records management and my customer loyalty. And actually, I don't really care what the law says anymore, because this is part of my core values and how I want to run my business. And I see that as a competitive advantage and something that will increase my revenues rather than a threat. There's a real evolution, a real sort of, oh God, I hate to use the term, but journey. There's a real journey. And you've got to take organizations through that, from day one, where a senior manager turns to you and says, yeah, I've heard that we're going to be fined if we don't do something. What's the minimum I've got to do to reach the red line? And you're like, well, what red line? How do I armor up? How do I, like, as I said, as a lawyer would say, how do I defend myself? And then you've got to take them from the point of view of that threat they're defending themselves against to, this is an asset that's going to bring them dividends. And that's why I think the standards and the frameworks can come in useful, as long as they're more of a maturity model and like not a binary yes, no, do we comply with the law or not model. But just my opinion. Do
you think, I mean, we've talked a little bit before and with previous guests about that sort of GDPR certification. We had a question on a webinar that we were doing the other day from a company that's actually in the US and has European customers, and they were saying, when our customer says to us, are you GDPR compliant? And we're saying yes. Like, how do we prove that? And there is no sort of standard form. So that certification is a way of doing that. Do you think it has value if it's done properly? Do you think businesses will want to do it if it's done properly, or does it become like 27001, where the people that really want to do it properly, and the people that want it but don't want to do it properly, will take the easy route and have somebody create it for them?
Well, there's a certain amount of human nature. Yeah, there's a certain amount of human nature, and as I'm sure a good colleague of mine would say to you, everything's fine until you introduce the human. Yeah, the certification schemes in their nature, are perhaps set out to be in a perfect world, and we don't live in a perfect world. So to me, there's an 80-20 rule. There are plenty of organizations out there that are doing it, in good faith and want to achieve good returns and good dividends, and we'll see the return on investment it brings them, even if they went into it because it's a requirement of the supply chain, or they were forced into it by their customer and says, you can't bid for this contract unless you have it. We saw that adoption with 27001. It went from what the hell's this to a nice to have, to a you'll get bonus points if you have it, to a well, everyone else has got it, why haven't you, to you can't even bid if you don't have it. You know what I mean? So, and I'm sure we'll see similar sort of adoption curves with this. But you're right, there will be a number of organisations that will see dollar signs, that will start up with non-accredited certification without the proper rigour. There will be auditors and assessors, 20% of them that are quite frankly not worth employing, who will let organisations go through because they're paying the money. It's the 80-20 rule. That we don't live in a perfect world. It provides some assurance, but always read the small print. Do your own due diligence, right? That's kind of important. And that's how I look at vendors. That's how I look at supplier evaluation. You kind of put them into risk categories, and you say there's some that we're going to kick into the low grass and not look at. There's some that we might want to meet with weekly and get measurements and metrics and do our own audits. And there's some in the middle that we might be happy with a third-party badge. Choose your own risk. Yeah, Yeah,
it's very true. You get what you pay for, I think, a lot as well.
Yeah.
You see that a lot.
That's why, Richard, you're a very, very expensive man, of course.
Thank you very much. But yeah, we see a lot of that sort of certified DPO or certified GDPR practitioner, and it's where that training comes from and who you're being trained by has a huge impact on the knowledge and the information that actually you're going to get given as part of that activity.
I mean, I've got some thoughts on that as well. I mean, you've got to take everything I say with a pinch of salt, because I wear too many hats, and one of the hats I wear is an IAPP trainer. So, I train a lot of their CIPE and CIPM courses, and they've received some criticism. 2-day followed by a multiple choice exam doth not a privacy practitioner make, right? There's a good benchmark, the good entry level qualifications. To me, you can learn more going on an uncertified course by someone who knows what they're talking about than from a mass-produced structured course, which might be delivered by somebody who is just going through the motions, and doesn't have that deep bench of understanding or experience. Even if I'm delivering, and I perhaps shouldn't say this in a public forum, the IPP material, that's going to be supplemented, right, by examples and experience, and you don't just sit there reading the IPP slides. I can't think of a worse thing to do to anyone. That's no offense to the IPP slides. It's just I don't like people who read from slides. So the slides are a useful benchmark for me to know I'm kind of in the right place and keeping to time, but apart from that, it's war stories and experience and encouraging a conversation between the delegates, because privacy is a conversation. It's an argument. There are no right or wrong answers. You just have to argue your case the best you can, and the regulator might disagree, the data subject might disagree, but as long as you've done your homework and can present your arguments well, you're going to get points for showing you're working. Showing you're working is what I always tell people. Do your homework, show you're working. It's like being back at school.
Yeah, and you hear that. You do hear that a lot, and you think you hear that from the regulator stance when they're looking at enforcement. If when you read the enforcement notices, you see the companies where they've at least tried to demonstrate that they gave it some thought, or they thought it was going to be all right, and actually they got it wrong. So the impact on you is far less than the organisation that just went.
Yeah.
Didn't care, didn't think about it. Just did it anyway.
It's lines of defence, definitely. It's lines of defence. One of the things I always go through with senior management is I have a slide with loads of animals on it, and I love asking them what privacy animal they are. They love it. I don't know why they love it so much, but it's become a regular feature of my sort of opening presentation, because I ask people honestly, who are you? Are you a turtle? Are you armouring up? Are you a tortoise? Do you want to stick your head back in your shell and armor up? Are you a elephant? Are you big and heavy and slow to turn? Are you a hamster in a wheel, just sort of going 90 miles an hour, delivering and can't look at anything else? Are you an ostrich? You buried your head in the ground and exposed your bum? Are you a fox, a risk manager? Are you a lion who wants to use privacy to roar to your customer and as a competitive advantage and as a marketing tool? People love that stuff, but I think it's a really useful analogy to kind of go into a business and very quickly say, who are you? Who do you want to be?
Right, then, because everybody wants to be a lion. Nobody wants to be an ostrich. But realization that maybe you are a bit of an ostrich.
Yeah, I mean the true lions are very rare. The organisations who really have it. And I can think of a few global multinational companies on one hand that I won't name, who kind of say, we're going to fight for you, our consumer, regardless what the law says. We'll go against the government. We don't care what the law says. This is our ethical standpoint as a company, and we want to have good privacy in everything we do by design, regardless of what the law says. I was having a conversation with one of my clients yesterday, and they had an HR manager who was saying, well, the CCPA gives individuals less rights than the GDPR. So, for the Californians, we'll say you can have these CCPA rights, and for the Europeans, they can say we'll have your GDPR rights. But, the argument is, as a policy for the business, don't you want to say, look, we're one business, we've got to treat everyone the same globally. If we can hit that higher GDPR gold standard, we know we're good anywhere. There'll be regional variation, obviously, but just sort of as an ethics approach, you might say as a global business, no, this is who we are. Regardless of what the local law is, we'll give you rights wherever you are. Do you know what I mean? And and I think that's rare. It's rare. I mean, that's where I like to leave organisations. As a consultant, you like to write yourself out and leave them with something sustainable. If you're a good consultant, that is. If you're not one that's just there for the repeat business, is a different matter. But if you can leave them with something sustainable and an ethical approach, that goes beyond the law in my estimation. And I have to ask customers who they are. Don't write in your privacy notice, your privacy is very important to us if your business model is data monetization.
Yeah. Don't lie.
Don't lie. Be honest about who you are. And I think we could all do benefit from that. Organizations, instead of saying your privacy is very important to us, starting off the privacy notice, saying our model is data monetization, but this is what you get in return. This is the value exchange. You give up a bit and you get a bit. And this is the deal. And I just think if you're more honest about it as an organization, transparency, and legal requirements notwithstanding, you're going to be in a better place.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think people are happy to give up a little bit of themselves if they know what they're getting in return. But, people appreciate honesty. They like to know what's going on, and if you're clear and saying, if you fill in this form, we are going to spam the life out of you, but you might win a cruise. Then at least you know what you're getting into. And I think that's always been the challenge with Facebook. I think people have always seen it. They haven't seen that value exchange. It's, Facebook is for me to use. Like, I can talk to my friends, but you don't pay for it. So there has to be.
Well, you do pay for it. It's just not a monetary
not
value.
Cash.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's another thing I just like. Every few months, like, we get these posts coming up online about, companies should pay you for your data, which I get, and I see the value exchange side of it, but I'm also a little bit of a fundamental human rights activist at heart, and therefore, as soon as we start talking about paid for privacy, we then get into those situations where the rich can afford the privacy and the poor can't, and disadvantaged people will end up selling their data as a income supplement, or of some kind, rather than the point in Europe, at least, which is free human rights for all as a basic common denominator. But the commercial world and the US model that we see doesn't really evolve that way. So you only have to look at the App Store. If you want a free app, your privacy will be the price. If you want a paid for app, you won't have adverts, and that's a US model. It's not a fundamental human rights model from the EU.
No, it's just good business sense, I suppose, isn't it? You can't argue with that.
Yeah, and you got to kind of, with business especially, have that kind of just the honesty about value exchange, and decide who you want to be. If you want to be a data monetization. Now, I was involved in a customer a few years ago. We're no longer working together, and this will probably explain why. In that, they were taking data out the back end of another app, an app that we all use for inquiring about national tracks, that sort of app. And they were taking data out of the back end of it and, using it for geo-fencing people, looking at people's real-time geolocation data, and using adverts, like McDonald's would give them an advertising ID of someone they'd serve an advert to and say, has this person been in a McDonald's in the next 24 hours, And they claimed it wasn't personal data because it was just real-time geolocation data, because that isn't a unique fingerprint,
No.
Because it wasn't people's names and addresses. And then they claimed, well, it wasn't their app, so they had no control over what the user was shown. And somewhere in the privacy notice, it said, we might give some data to third parties. Do you know what I mean? And then I said, well, what you really want, so I went through the legal basis with them. It's not a legal necessity. It's not contractual, probably not legitimate interest. You're probably down to consent. It's not public or vital. And I said, well, so what you need to do is have the app provider say, do we want to use your geolocation data for purpose one, showing you where the nearest station is. Purpose two, giving to our third party for marketing. Their answer will go with me to my grave. It was, we couldn't do that. And I said, why? And he said, well, if we told people we were doing that, they wouldn't let us. And I was like, if that's the foundation of your business model, if people knew we were doing it, they wouldn't let us. I don't think we've got much more to talk about here. You know what I mean? I'll write you your report that kind of says I don't think you've got a legal basis. Feel free to ignore it. Do you know what I mean? And that was pretty. And it was a shame because I would have loved to have helped them develop something that was a little bit more transparent. But some organisations just don't want to go down that route.
Choose your battles, don't you? There's no point in trying to push stuff on a company that doesn't want to do it. Yeah,
and it's sad, right? It's sad. It's frustrating for me because, I want to help. I want to improve people's lives. That's why we do this, right? We don't do it. We don't do it for the fame or the power or the money, right? We want to genuinely help people, and that's at the heart of what we do. And sometimes we've got to, when our customers are paying our salaries, I think we've got to demonstrate to the customers that privacy can be a win-win, that data protection can be good for business, that it doesn't have to be a versus conversation. It doesn't have to be an either. It's an and, not an or. And we have to. And it's quite difficult when they've been programmed for so long. Data protection says no.
Yeah.
To sort of convince them that it's a value-adding area for their organisation. It's a difficult journey. Say the word journey again.
That's true. So, and touching on a couple of bits that we went through there, we were talking about the differences in rules in the US to the UK. I know that you do a lot of work in terms of creating international laws. So you've been doing a lot of work in Africa, Asia, and the US as well. Do you think is there starting to be a shift towards more European focused style privacy laws in the international countries, or do you think it's still it's still a bit more commercial?
I mean, your US starting point is consumer rights rather than human rights. That's it's very interesting. The starting point in some parts of Asia and the Far East is going to be state rights rather than human rights. Well, let's face it. If you're working in China or North Korea or Russia or those sorts of areas, you've got to take that on board in the culture you're working in. Africa has been really interesting for me because, out of the 50 member states of the African Union, I think something like 21 now have got privacy laws. Wow. You can pretty much split Africa into two in terms of Francophile and Anglophile Africa, depending on the sad colonial history we've got there. And I mostly work in the Anglophile states. I guess a lot of them will have 95 directive. The ones that have law will have 95 directive laws, if that makes sense. That sort of previous generation of privacy law. Enforcement is obviously poor, depending where you are. Even in South Africa and Ghana, which have got some pretty well developed, privacy laws, they've had a regulator for some time. The regulator's got to go to a court to impose any sort of fine, and it's a long-winded, difficult process, as opposed to like a more administrative GDPR style fine that we would see in Europe now, in some countries in Europe. Sorry, excuse my natural sarcasm. Yeah, I mean, just as an interesting aside, I do a lot of work in Malta as well with the gambling companies in Malta, and the head of the IDPC in Malta, their data protection commissioner, is now the data protection officer for Leo Vegas. So, it shows how close the industries are in certain countries, right? So that's quite an interesting sort of little jump, I imagine, from gamekeeper to poacher, or, but yeah, in Africa especially, it's certainly emerging. This is a company that doesn't want countries, certainly my contacts in Ghana especially, don't want to enter into a digital form of slavery, is the way they've put it, which I think is a really sort of, given the background and history, it's a very sort of loaded thing to say. They don't want to end up in a digital slavery. They're conscious that the laws and enforcement isn't there, but they're conscious if they want their businesses to compete on a world stage, to attract investment. Imagine a Nigerian business emailing someone in the UK and asking for investment. It's stacked. It's stacked. It's a difficult thing. And therefore, they've got to ask questions whether, again, they want to comply with national law or international law. Mauritius is very well advanced. Mauritius has gone to, I attended a conference in Mauritius a couple of years ago. I was invited to speak for African Digital Rights Hub, which wasn't the worst invite I'd ever had. Come to Mauritius and speak for a couple of hours and spend 3 or 4 days in Mauritius. It wasn't the worst invite I'd ever had. But yeah, the problem with a place like Africa is a lack of harmony. There's a lack. They don't have a club. They have the African nations, which is a little bit like the EU, but it goes from the really, really civilized to the war-torn and downbeaten, and to me, in those areas, that's where human rights are even more closely needed. I wrote a code of practice down there on digital identity cards for them, because that's becoming more and more of a thing. But at the same time, you don't want a rogue government to ethnically cleanse half a population because that's what's on their identity card, or even down to the tribe they belong to, or the ethnicity they have. It's so interesting. Just so much.
Because am I right in thinking that you did some work on the sort of humanitarian aid side of things as well? So trying to move people around and then keeping track of their identity. Like, these people haven't got passports, they haven't got driving licenses, and there was talk of biometrics to try and track these people. But how do they have any way of enforcing their rights over how that information gets used?
Again, I can't take any credit there. Our good friend Emma Butler, formerly at the ICO office, now at Yoti.
Yoti, yeah.
She introduced me to an organisation called Simprints in Cambridgeshire. Now, interesting enough, what they do is they attach a mobile fingerprint reader to a mobile phone.
Yeah.
With the concept to try and get aid to the right place. So if you are Doctors Without Borders or Oxfam or any organisation that wants to distribute medicine or food or aid in a developing country, you're right. They're not going to wander around with passports. They're not going to wander around with identity documents. The one thing they do have is a unique fingerprint. And there were some really interesting discrimination biases in the tech. And these students at Cambridge University, realised that all fingerprints readers had been developed for white Western fingerprints, and didn't take into account a more worn fingerprint or a fingerprint from Africa, with sort of a very, the false positive rate was much higher. So they developed this wonderful tech, this fingerprint reader you could attach to a mobile phone, take out into the field to verify, that the right people had got the right aid, people weren't claiming it twice, it was going to the right place. But we had some very interesting conversations about whether they were a controller or a processor, because my first thought was, well, you're only a processor because you're carrying this out on behalf of Doctors Without Borders as their as their identity verification agent. But they said, no, we don't want to release this data. They said, we want the data. A, we want to use it to improve our tools and our software. So we want to be the controller for that. And B, we actually might not want to release the data and the fingerprints to the organisation we're working for. If we're working for a national government and we suspect they might be worried they might be doing something dodgy or going to do some ethnic cleansing or something, we actually want to give them a yes, no on the individual, but don't want to give them the fingerprint database. So there were some really interesting things about, I know data protection law doesn't touch data ownership and intellectual property, but some really conversations about, we want to be the controller. We want to be ethically responsible for this data. We're going to do PAAs on this. We're going to do a PAA for everything we do. And they put them all available online. Really interesting company to work for that, again, their starting point was ethically, we want to get this right. Damn the law, damn the, we want to do the right things for the right people. And that was a beautiful, really young company, just a really privilege to kind of work with that sort of organization, with that sort of ethos going forwards. Again, small companies, almost a startup mentality, wanted to be quite agile, idea of documentation, it comes quite alien to those companies. Again, they'd use third-party providers, even though they're tiny, they'd put everything in Google and those sort of companies. So you've then got that extra element of like, well, is that a safe place to put it? And, but who else are we going to go to? Are we going to develop our own data centers and cloud storage? It's some really fascinating sort of concerns, and then you've got some other interesting things. So all of those individuals have got GDPR rights because the company's established in Cambridge. But how are you going to educate somebody who turns up and wants some food? Here's a privacy notice. By the way, your data is going to be processed with Doctors Without Borders and Simprints, and here's how to claim your rights.
Here's how to email the data protection officer.
Well, exactly. Well, these people don't have email, or well, some of them can't read. It's showing videos while they're waiting in the line is a kind of a weird. Having someone read a privacy notice to them as they're putting their finger on a bit of technology that they might not even recognise in some cases is, really interesting kind of place to be.
Yeah, it goes back to almost what you were saying before about privacy, or trying to avoid privacy becoming a rich poor thing. These people you're trying to help these people. You're trying to to give them aid. You're trying to get them out of a situation that could be life-threatening.
Sure.
But because of the situation they're in, it's then really hard to give them any respect to their right to privacy, because you can't explain to them that this company they're never going to meet in a country they're never going to go to is collecting information and potentially is going to be shared with government bodies, or nations that want to cause them harm. And you either give me your fingerprint or you don't get.
Well, we always made sure there was an alternative.
You get food and water.
We always made sure there was an alternative. Yeah. We didn't make it mandatory. There was no way ethically you could make giving your fingerprint contingent upon giving them age. There was no way we could do that. And there was no way we wanted to do that, So, that you could say that puts a hole through the entire process. But, these things have got to be, in some degree voluntary, and you can't introduce these barriers to getting the right things to the right people who need them. But then you look at our country. I mean, we've got a government at the moment, and excuse a political statement, that won't commit on the international stage to human rights after post-Brexit, and sticks an immigration exemption for some of the people who need sort of protections the most right through the middle of our data protection law. So against a background like that, I'm not going to say that these situations are going to be unique to the working in Africa or Asia or anywhere like that. In fact, my overwhelming opinion about working in a place like Africa is there's more that connects us than divides us. With the internet and things like that, we're in the situation where we've got truly global companies, but piddly governments, tiny governments nationally, that want to try and impose some of their own power and data protection law, and want to reintroduce borders to a world that, quite frankly, has almost outgrown those borders. You've got companies that are more powerful than countries, and when you get a situation with Facebook where you get like 9 or 10 countries either sitting around a table and there's an empty chair for Mark Zuckerberg at the end of it, I mean,
that's a lot, isn't it?
When a company can be more powerful than a country, certainly got more resources than a national regulator.
Yeah.
In order to fight something or prevent something going through Parliament, or you look at their, and I'm not saying they're the evil empire, but you look at their purchasing of sort of Nick Clegg as an advocate for them across Europe, and the speak out against the privacy regulation, and it certainly gives you an idea where certain companies stand, but hopefully in the long run, consumers might see through it. I don't know, and hopefully vote with their feet, but I don't know. In some countries, Facebook is the internet.
Yeah, it's very true. Very, very true.
So, it's a difficult world in which we live in. And, it's certainly not the world I was faced with 20 years ago. Data protection officers, we were kind of gone through this remit where the data protectioners I started with 20 years ago were records managers. They were archivists, librarians. They were people with their fingers on the paper-based records in the filing cabinet. They were, my first boss, as I said, used to print out her emails and stick them in her in tray. I remember it very clearly when she first got a computer. She'd print out her emails, put them in the in tray, which was just fascinating. I was younger and a bit more tech savvy. I just looked at this with like, but it was, people were smoking in offices and coming in at 10, going for a 3-hour lunch and leaving at 4, right? Yeah, I mean, when I compare those archivists and librarians, the people who started data protection, to what happened with the 2000s, where we saw it went away from the data and started to become about lawyers writing the most complicated privacy statements they could, and it being about data processing agreements and international transfers. I'd like to think that if the GDPR has done anything, it's kind of made data protection a little bit more practical again. A little bit more about implementation. The rise of privacy by design and privacy engineers, getting it right first time, making sure that privacy controls are built in from the outset, because once something's known, it can't be unknown. It's a Pandora's box, right? Once it's opened, it can't be shut. So, getting it right first time is going to be key. And organizations don't. People don't.
So do you think, like, we're coming, don't want to keep you too long, But from your experience, from going back, you know, to the original days, to the archivists, to the librarians, and then looking forward, you know, let's say 5 years, where do you think we're going? Do you think we're going to a consumer-led understanding of privacy? Because I don't see it. I think some businesses will drive it, but for me, it feels more like it's going to be the consumer asking for more, demanding more, and companies responding rather than companies just outright offering. So, do you think that journey is going to continue over the next sort of 5-10 years?
I do. I mean, my personal opinion is that the regulators are failing and it's not their fault. I know some of my other colleagues who have been on these pub chats before may say differently, but you know, the regulators have got a super hard job to do with limited resources that can't match the resources of those that they're trying to enforce against or regulate or try and influence. You know, when you get regulators wandering around the globe delivering speeches on data ethics rather than issuing enforcement, perhaps that's almost an acknowledgement on their side that they might have lost. That, you know, I often tell people that for the last 20 years I've fought a vanguard of a losing battle, but by God, am I going to fight it? You know, so looking forwards for the next 5-10 years, I think the one thing companies are slowly recognizing, and actually I'd say more in the US than here in Europe. More in the US. I mean, I do a lot of international work, and the work I do with the US, it's the customer is key. And if you're going to get a customer who wants to sue you, I think companies will probably should. I think the 20 million euro and the 4% of global annual turnover, I don't think that's the headline you should have said. I think the headline should have been, all you need is a data breach and a load of hungry lawyers who develop some sort of class action lawsuit. And you know, you forget the potential for damage or distress. That's a potential unlimited. It's just the amount of damage or distress you cause to each individual, right? Yeah. So forget 20 million euros, and you know, if you get like the entire of the internet user who's ever used Google being you know, given even $10 each to you know, that makes a 20 million euro or 4% of global annual turnover look pretty small. So I think it's going to be private action. I think where the regulators are failing, I think it's going to be organizations realizing that in a data-driven society, trust is key, that your customers have got to trust you. And we're already seeing companies, and I'm going to say Apple here, I'm not suggesting they're any better or worse than anything else, but you know, we're starting to see, you know, their keynote, their WWDC, you know, they had a whole section on privacy saying, we're going to make companies ask for consent in a better way for you, and we're going to block access to, you know, until the user said yes. And they've got an entire advertising campaign based on privacy. I went to CES one year in Vegas, and they didn't have a stand. You know, there was Huawei and Samsung and all of the other mobile phone providers there saying, you know, look at our phone, it's got more megapixels than the phone across the hall. It's got a faster processor than the phone across the hall. And Apple wrote on the side of a hotel, whatever happens on your iPhone stays on your iPhone.
Oh, yes, I remember that.
Yeah, which was, we're not going to bother having a stand there. I mean, it's a great play on the what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. And I'm not suggesting that they're in any way better or worse than any other company. But what I'm suggesting is certainly they've realized that there's a market, that there is a competitive advantage against their competitors in saying, we're going to be better ethically, morally. Trust us. This is who we are. This is our brand. We will fight governments for you if we have to, you know. And that's a really powerful message. And I think even if the regulators fail, I think it's going to be consumer-driven behavior where I see hope. How's that?
I like that a lot. I like that Apple still pushes the rhetoric that we don't need. You know, it's not about data, it's about the product. You know, we don't care who you are. This is what we sell, and you can come and get it. But yeah, I think that's.
And again, you know, I've seen that whole thing. You know, again, you still see data protection versus everywhere you go, and that really annoys me. It's actually, you know, to me, it's and not or. I keep saying it's when you don't have a right to privacy, data protection law is suddenly important. And people misunderstand, you know, the common person only thinks in terms of data breaches and confidentiality, you know, a disclosure. Whereas actually, you know, things like legal basis and much more fundamental in data protection law is the understanding that you can't have data unless you've got a reason. That justification and the transparency there upon it. There are the accuracy principle, the retention principles. There's so many other principles as opposed to just security. And I'm talking because I spent a lot of time in the security world as well as the privacy world. But the common man on the street, if you like, the individual, who we have to reasonably have in our head when committing an action. Will associate data protection with information security as opposed to what we know it as.
Yeah.
And that's a difficult thing to kind of get over. I mean, if you listen to the media, all you'd understand is organisations have got to ask for your consent to everything. You've got a right to erasure, and hold them accountable if they spill your data out onto the street. And that's not what data protection is. It is, but it isn't.
It's not the pure. It's not what it's all about.
Yeah.
There's more to it. When it makes sense.
Yeah.
Awesome. That was really, 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 really fascinating.
Well, for you and I, perhaps. I
do these because I find it fascinating.
I mean, for me, I don't like being broadcast on YouTube. I'm a privacy professional, but it's taken a global pandemic for it to happen. Yeah. But when you go out the other end of this place, I think I certainly don't want fame or recognition or anything like that. But I just want it to matter that you've lived. And I think if we can all make that contribution in a small way, if I always finish my training courses by saying to people, it's like those alcohol adverts, it's like the gambling adverts. I say to people, you're now my disciples. Data is a bit of an addiction for companies and organisations. So please treat personal data responsibly. That's kind of my tagline, I guess.
For me, I don't think people realize what goes on in the background. I don't think people realize how hard people in this industry work to make life, or to try and make life better, to try and make businesses accountable. And I enjoy this because I get to ask the questions to the things that I really want to know. And to me, that's fascinating enough. But I think it's important that people get to see what goes on behind the scenes and how hard people are working to that don't publicize themselves and aren't that aren't as big as Max Schrems and aren't as big as Noib.eu and don't have that platform, but are still trying to make a difference. And this is just an opportunity to get out there for me.
Yeah, I mean, you just get your head down and get the work done, and try and keep your customers happy, try and deliver that win-win scenario we're all after, which is not an easy balance to strike. Ultimately try and serve the individuals at the end of the day, right? And there's your raison d'etre, your reason to be, right? To feel like you're making a difference, and that's when I leave the industry. When I leave the industry is when I feel like I can no longer make a difference. When I feel like and I'm genuinely privileged, genuinely lucky to feel like data protection has never been more important. With technology and robots and drones and geolocation, mobile computing and cloud computing and connected sex toys and all of that stuff. It's gonna come on, and you laugh, but sex tech is a real issue. That's the reason why VHS won over Betamax. Because human sexuality is a natural part of our nature, and it drives technological advancement as much as warfare does. So actually, but to be involved with some of these companies are really interesting. I had some very interesting ethical questions when I was dealing with a photography company, a modeling company, and I was like, do I want to be involved with some CD company that takes pictures of undressed women and real? But then actually, if they've come to me, are they trying to get it right? And therefore you want to help.
If the door's open.
Yeah, and real interesting sort of conversations you have on a daily basis about where you feel you can best spend your use of the time. For me, it's yeah, all right, people look down on standards and regulations and codes of practice and things like that. But if you can hit a wide audience and influence as many people as you can, that's a good thing.
Cool, love it. We've really enjoyed that, Ralph O'Brien. We'll put all of your details down below as well.
Well, it's been a privilege.
Ralph's on Twitter, he's on LinkedIn, and obviously he's got his own consulting company as well, so make sure you check out those details down below. But it's been awesome having you on, and hopefully when we're allowed out again, we'll just go and have a real pint.
Yeah, it's gone invisible. I've got an invisible pint.
It's gone.
Virtual backgrounds, I love them. I've been in Star Wars, Tatooine, you name it. The cockpit, the Millennium Falcon. You're lucky you've got an office today.
I love it. Awesome. Thank you very much, Ralph. Good to speak to you. See you soon.